Hi, I'm Dudley Hall. Welcome to the last session of Epic March. You're going to get to hear Alan Wright. Alan has been a favorite of the Epic Conference since we began. He has the unique ability to tell the stories that illustrate the story. So you're going to love this.
Are you ready for some good news? Narrow is the gate that leads to life. What? You say that's good news? How can that be good news? That sounds like terrible news. I just want to be free. That's one of the great mantras of today's world. In Epic March, we are talking about all of the prevailing ideologies and culture and what is the true gospel in contrast to that. And I want to talk about a toughie with you today, about freedom, what freedom really means. And it's not what the spirit of the age says. Here's what Jesus has to say in Matthew 7. Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide, and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow, and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. That's the English Standard Version, but let's look at the NIV, which I actually think in this case is better. Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and few find it. Narrow and only a few find it. What in the world does Jesus mean by this? And how could it possibly be good news for us? Well, have you heard the old joke about the ladies that die, she goes to heaven, and Peter's at the gates, and he says, in order to get into heaven, you have to spell a word. And she says, oh no, I'm not that good of a speller. What's the word? He said, the word is love. And she says, oh, I know that one, L-O-V-E. And he says, well, that's exactly right. Come on into glory. Well, she's there for a little while, and her husband, her ex-husband, who'd been an adulterer, a philanderer, and a really bad husband, a bad man, suddenly he dies, and he's at the gate of heaven. And it so happens that Peter has told the woman, would you watch the gate for a little while I run a couple of errands? So there's the woman at the gate, and this old scoundrel of a husband shows up, and she says to him, well, you can come in, but you got to spell a word. And he says, what's the word? And she says, Czechoslovakia. Is it hard or is it easy to get into heaven? Well, we're kind of mixed up about the question. On the one hand, most religions essentially say it's hard to get into it. Buddhism, nirvana is reached by following an eightfold path very carefully. Hinduism, salvation depends upon breaking out of the cycle of reincarnation, ridding oneself of bad karma. Islam, salvation comes to those who obey Allah sufficiently enough that the good deeds outweigh the bad. Mormonism, to reach the highest heaven, one must not only believe in God, but be baptized in the church, be a member of the LDS church, obey the Mormon word of wisdom, including not drinking hot drinks, and always tithing, and complete the temple rituals in order to make you temple worthy. The list could go on and on. And then we come to the Christian gospel, which says over and over, salvation is totally free. What could be easier than that? And yet we come to Matthew 7, and Jesus says that narrow is this gate. The ESV says the way is hard that leads to life. And that word for hard is a Greek word that actually means pressed in on or squashed. So that's why I like the NIV better. It really means narrow. And I think Jesus is saying here that the way to heaven, both on earth, heaven on earth, and ultimately with God, is narrow and squashed. It's a narrow gate, and it feels like it's all pressed in. See, here's the thing. We all agree freedom is wonderful. And here's what the spirit of the age says. We will have freedom only if we make it very broad. In other words, the whole society defines freedom as something that is very, very broad. The idea of a narrow truth with narrow limitations seems like the opposite of freedom, doesn't it? At least according to the spirit of the age. Don't let anyone tell you what you ought to do. Don't let anyone tell you who you ought to be. Don't let anyone tell you where you ought to go. This is the idea of the spirit of the age, where the restraints on our lives of someone else telling me what I ought to do feels so constricting. And there's been a lot of abuses of authority and it's led us into this way of thinking. Our society thinks the word narrow is one of the worst words imaginable. And at first glance, narrow is a word that doesn't have good connotations to it. The Greek word here for narrow is stenos, like stenosis. If you go to the doctor, you don't want to get a report that you got stenosis of anything. It means the narrowing, the stricture, the constraining of the flow of a vessel or a valve or some kind of tube in your body. You don't want a stenosis. We don't want something that's narrow. The neighborhood that I live in, the roads are narrow. Now, thankfully, it's a private, quiet little neighborhood, and there's not much traffic. Until recently, during pandemic, the Amazon trucks have all come. And the Amazon trucks can't really fit on our roads. And so every night when my wife and I go walking, we're bemoaning how there's just a permanent looking mud track on the outside of the road because there's not quite enough room. If I'm riding down the road, what would I rather have? A wide road where I've got some wiggle room or a narrow road? Of course, I want it to be wide. I don't like tight spaces. People don't like tight spaces. Years ago, in a previous house I owned, we started to smell an awful odor. It smelled like a dead thing. And finally, my wife said, I think it's coming from the crawl space under the house. Alan, you got to go down there and find the dead animal. Well, this crawl space is small, not more than about 3 feet at any place. And then to get to the area where we thought we smelled the dead animal, it got more and more narrow until there's not enough room to even roll over. And I had to crawl all the way back there. And I was thinking the whole time, what happens when I get back here and find the dead animal? I would like to have some space around me. And if narrow just means restricted, then let's face it, I don't want it. And if narrow means bigoted, if narrow means prejudice, if narrow means simply intolerant in the bad sense of the word, I don't want it. You know, what are the roots really in the end of all of our bigotry and prejudice and racism? It started in the beginning, because when Adam and Eve were tempted, they had this expansive garden, and they were tempted by this serpent. The picture of Satan and the way that the devil lies to us was essentially to say, look, but there's one thing you don't have. And if you will eat of that tree, then it'll be eye-opening. Your world will get bigger. The garden will be bigger to you if you can eat of that one tree. And when they ate, instead, the garden was closed up on them. And what happened? What happened was shame entered the world, and they began hiding from each other and hiding from God. And they began blaming each other. And this is what happens. When we don't know how to take our shame, that horrible feeling of angst that says there's something wrong with me, if we don't know how to take that to God and have it be healed in the deep, affirming, cleansing power of the gospel, if we don't know how to do that, then what do we do with that shame? Well, we can swallow it and just be miserable, or we can do what most people do, try to shift it, try to pretend it's not there. And I think this is the root of all of our bigotry and racism. If somebody is having to act like I'm better than you are, you can be sure they actually have a hurting ego. You don't have to think about self unless self is hurting. You don't have to act better than other people unless you feel inferior to other people. That's the real root of it. So people think, erroneously, that what it means to be a Christian, specifically this word evangelical that's been lost in society to now, people think that what it means is you're a narrow-minded person. Somebody was talking to my brother, a lawyer, and it was another lawyer that he happened to bump into, and this lawyer was familiar with me. The lawyer goes to a very liberal Christian church, and I love what he said to my brother. He said, I listen to Alan sometimes. He said, he's the least irritating evangelical I've ever heard. It betrays the fact that that's what people think. That evangelicals are narrow-minded bigots, and they are irritating. So it's surprising, isn't it? All that is to say, isn't it a little surprising that Jesus would use this word narrow, stenos? He would use another word that means pressed in or squashed together. Because isn't the whole beauty of the gospel an invitation to the expansiveness of the love of God? Doesn't the word narrow not seem to fit God? Because God is the one of whom we know His love is so wide and long and high and deep. Some years ago, I wrote this about the love of God. I wish I could tell you how wide the love of God is. You can't go around it. You can't find someone that God doesn't want to reach. God loves people lost in religion and people lost in rebellion. He loves old people and young people. He loves black people and white people and brown people and tan people. He loves people in North Carolina and South Carolina, North Korea and South Korea, the Far East, the Mid East, and down under. He loves rich and poor people, educated and illiterate people. He loves those who love Him and He loves those who hate Him. Oh, the love of God is wide. I wish I could tell you how long the love of God is. It's so long you can't get in front of it and you can't get behind it. You can't outrun it. You can't stop it. His love is from everlasting to everlasting, pure and perfect. It's long enough to be in your past and your future. His love doesn't give up, doesn't quit, doesn't stop. You can't truncate it. You can't abbreviate it. You can't interrupt it. His love was there when you were born. His love was there at creation. His love was there before we spoke. Oh, I wish I could tell you about the length of the love of God. I wish I could tell you how high is the love of God. It's higher than the highest building, taller than the tallest mountain. It is transcendent. It is heavenly. It's taller than the tallest Goliath. It's higher than the greatest intellect, taller than your greatest dream. Oh, I wish I could tell you how high is the love of God. And I wish I could tell you how deep is the love of God. His love is deeper than your secret thoughts, your darkest hour, or your deepest pit. His love is deeper than any philosopher's wisdom. His love is deeper than the deepest well, and it never runs dry. Oh, I wish I could tell you about the depths of God's love. I want to spend all my life talking about how wide and long and high and deep is the love of God. So it's odd to say, here's some good news. The way of life is through a narrow gate. How can we understand this? So that when you're hearing the messages of culture, I just want to be free. I just want to keep my options open. I don't want anybody to tell me what to do. I don't want to be restricted. I don't want to be too committed to something. I don't want anybody telling me. I just want to be free. When you hear that, contrast it with what Jesus is saying, and to make sense of it, we have to think about a paradox, which means two things that seem like they can't be true at the same time, and yet they are. Let's use a couple examples when you think about this narrow gate. You can imagine that you're in a big field and you see a little narrow gate. Well, if you're already in the big field, an abundant pasture, let's say, that gate looks very restrictive. But let's imagine instead you're in a crowded space, which is an unsafe space, an unhappy place, and then you see a gate, and on the other side of it is a huge, lush pasture. Well, that narrow gate looks very promising to you then. Maybe think of it in a more stark way. Imagine someone who has been incarcerated for years and the time of their release has arrived and the inmate is escorted through the prison courtyard. So there's a courtyard, yes. And then they come to a very narrow gate, a very strict gate. And he's got to go out that gate in order to go to his freedom. He's not thinking about how narrow that gate is. That narrow gate is a tremendous gift. Here's another, maybe better example. Imagine Billy and Bob are college roommates. And Billy has decided he wants to go to medical school. And Bob's not sure what he wants to do. He would rather stay free and keep his options open. And Billy and Bob have completely different study habits. Billy is always finding a priority on his studies because he knows he needs to make good grades in order to get into medical school. And Bob says yes to every party, every time that he can go hang out with people, and he doesn't study hardly at all. He barely scrapes by in school, and he gets to his graduation, and he has no real idea what he wants to do, and he has very poor grades. Billy, on the other hand, has followed this very narrow path of study, 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 and he gains entrance into a wonderful medical school where he can fulfill his dreams of being able to help people be healed. And, of course, then Billy is also prosperous in his career, and he's able to help people and enjoy his life. So you could say, in a real sense, that Bob was the one who was looking free in college, and yet who was the one that was really free? If you were being treated for cancer and the radiation oncologist said, we can cure this through radiation, what they would do is put a radiating beam so precise that it only, if it's working at its best, goes to destroy cancer cells and nothing else. You want it extremely narrow. In other words, you can look at examples in life where narrow is not bad, narrow is good. So there's a paradox. On the one hand, we think freedom means broad and wide and open and nobody telling me where to go. And yet on the other hand, freedom, we know, sometimes only comes through something that's very, very specific and very narrow. What is Jesus talking about here in Matthew 7? Well, to understand it, it's best to think of the entire context of this that we call the Sermon on the Mount, because he's talking here about two very different groups of people. Matthew 5, verse 20, in the opening chapter of what we call the Sermon on the Mount, I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. So he's alerting us that what I'm talking about here is a contrast between the scribes and Pharisees who think that they're very, very righteous, who are always lording it over people, who elsewhere he calls whitewashed tombs full of dead men's bones, who elsewhere he says that you search the world over for a convert and then make him twice the son of hell that you are. This is what he's talking about, and a contrast between the Pharisees and the way that they think you get to heaven and how you get to heaven. And he says, I'm talking about a completely different righteousness that's even higher than the Pharisees, who would count out every little seed and every little bit of their spices just to make sure they were getting the tithe properly. Who could be more righteous than that? Matthew 6:1, he continues, beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them, for then you will have no reward from your Father who's in heaven. Matthew 6:5, the theme continues. And when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, that they may be seen by others. Truly, I say to you, they have received their reward. And Matthew 6:16, and when you fast, do not look gloomy like the hypocrites. They disfigure their faces that their fasting may be seen by others. Truly, I say to you, they have received their reward. In other words, Jesus is contrasting the way the Pharisees lived and their idea of the road to salvation with a different kind of way of being saved. He's contrasting, ultimately, law and grace. It's the big, broad way that most people live. And how do most people live? In America, if you say, do you think that you are going to heaven? People say yes. And if you say why, they say because I'm a good person. In other words, we tend to be either moralistic, I'm a good person, so I should get in, or if we reject it entirely, we're amoralistic, as if pretending that there is no real right or wrong. Those are the broad ways. In other words, what Jesus is saying is that the actual way that most people live is they're trying to let their good deeds outweigh their bad and think that that's what's going to lead them to life. And in the context of the Sermon on the Mount, we realize something totally different. See, what makes the gospel good is that Jesus came, lived a sinless life, died for you and me, so that anyone who trusts him, in no way meriting heaven on their own, is reckoned as if you and I merit heaven because we're credited with his righteousness. There's no other way, Jesus says. You could never qualify yourself. We can't even spell Czechoslovakia, much less can we bring enough of our righteousness to be able to buy our way into heaven or into an abundant life here on earth. The narrow gate, then, is actually, the uncommon way is actually the way of grace, the way of Jesus. So it feels extremely scandalous to say narrow is the gate until you understand that that little narrow place of grace is what he's talking about. And through that narrow place and that one narrow person, when Jesus said, I am the way and the truth and the life, it's like a gate that feels like it's going to be so constricting, but then it opens up to expansive life. I am the door, Jesus said in John 10. If anyone enters by me, he'll be saved and will go in and he will find pasture. Jesus is the narrow gate. In other words, is being saved hard? Is it hard to get into heaven? Well, no. Grace is the easiest thing imaginable. And yet, Jesus is saying, it seems that it's the hardest, the least popular, the most narrow way imaginable. Real freedom is not the freedom from submission. Real freedom is the freedom to submit. We once had a dog, only dog we ever had, Reese Peanut Butter Cup Wright was his name, and Reese was a beagle. And those beagles, they have got a strong nose, and what he wanted to do more than anything else in all the world was to be able to chase down a squirrel or find a rabbit scent and try as hard as we could to get him trained to stay or to heel and walk alongside of us. You could not take that dog off of a leash. Sometimes I would watch people walking along with their stately golden retrievers who would just walk so elegantly and calmly next to them off of the leash. But you could never take Reese off of the leash. We took him to the beach sometimes, and I'd see other people, they'd take their dog off the leash, and the dog would run and frolic in the water and come right back to him. If we'd taken our dog off the leash, he'd have caught a scent of a seagull and been gone over the dunes and never come back. In other words, none of us want to have the leash on us, but it's only the submitted dog that ever goes unleashed. We would like to think that we can just keep our options open. And that's what real freedom is. There's so much fear of missing out now, you can't get somebody to even RSVP to you, can you? They'll wait until the last day or the day before, just in case there's something a little better that might be coming up. Because we're so convinced that less commitment means more freedom. We're so convinced that more options means greater freedom. And the opposite is true. When I think about the greatest joys in my life, I start thinking about the most narrow commitments and the most narrow submissions of my life. Like 36 years ago, telling a woman that I promise to be your husband forever, as long as we both shall live. And when you're married and you're in a covenant like that, there are up days, there are down days, and yet what we never talk about is not being together. Because yes, on the one hand, when you say, I'm submitted in this covenant relationship to just this one woman, that's very narrow. But what it has opened up to me are depths of love and joy and intimacy and comfort and peace and opportunity that I never, ever could have if I had kept my options open. So what happened was, in the beginning, the serpent slithered in and tempted Adam and Eve. They had an expansive garden, every kind of beautiful tree pleasing to the eye, every kind of fruit delectable to taste. It was freedom. Paradise is vast and expansive and glorious and multicolored and vibrant, and they had eternity to spend sampling of every tree in the garden except one. And the temptation was, if you want to have a bigger world and be more free, don't let there be any limitations on that. You will be more free. You will have a bigger life, and your eyes will be open if you eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. They ate. And when they were in their shame, it was like their eyes were closed, and the whole world just closed in on them. And they're put out east of Eden. And what we've needed ever since is to get back into that expansive garden. What we've been longing for and what the whole world craves is to feel what that's like, to have that kind of expansive life, an abundant life, a real life, a free life. And that's what we want. And people everywhere are craving it throughout all time. And in our culture today, it is being craved more than ever before. So when you hear all the cries out for, I just want to be free, don't despise the cry. It is the primal ache of every human heart, because people feel constricted. They don't know why. They don't know the way. And it feels like it's just the opposite of good news to say, narrow is the gate. But this is the best news the world could hear today, is that there's a way called grace. It's the opposite of the way of the Pharisees. It's not moralism. It's not amoralism. It is a profound, narrow admittance that I could never find life on my own. And in that narrow confession, there's the drawing in to this very narrow, narrow gate, Jesus, who came to set the captives free. He came so we could be free. So is the love of God wide and long and high and deep? Yes. Is the way narrow? Yes. So when you hear the messages of the culture, and you'll hear them, I just want to be free, don't want anybody to tell me what to do, want to keep my options open, want to have no one in any way make me submit to anything, and that's what freedom is. Remember the Sermon on the Mount. And remember, there's a counterfeit ideology that's prevalent in our society trying to tell us what freedom is. And remember the words of Jesus, narrow is the gate, squashed in is the way that leads to life. But that gate, beloved, leads to an expansive garden. That's freedom, and that's the gospel.